The evening was settling softly over Bikini Bottom. The sun, dipping lower and lower beneath the gentle waves, painted the ocean in shades of amber and rose. The water outside the boating school rippled with a golden glow, every crest of a wave glistening like a piece of polished glass. Inside, the halls were quiet, still and hushed, as though the walls themselves were ready to rest after a long day. Mrs. Puff sat at her desk near the wide classroom window. The last hints of sunlight stretched through the water and spilled into the room, warming the wooden floorboards of the boating school. The light wasn't harsh or demanding. Instead, it was soft, like a comforting blanket being draped across the world. Mrs. Puff leaned slightly forward in her chair, her fins gently resting on a worn leather diary. The diary was small, its corners frayed from years of use, but it held countless evenings like this one. With the quiet scratch of a pen, she began to write. Each word moved slowly across the page, not rushed, not forced. She didn't feel the weight of the day anymore, not the noise of students, not even the usual chaos that sometimes followed SpongeBob's eager driving attempts. Instead, she felt the peace of the moment. A calm ocean outside, a still classroom inside. Her thoughts untangling themselves, one soft sentence at a time. The boating school itself seemed to sigh in relief. The rows of desks sat neatly in order, the chalkboard faintly dusted from earlier lessons. A faint scent of chalk lingered in the air, mixing with the salty scent of the sea. On the windowsill, a tiny seashell that one of her students had left behind earlier glowed with the sunset's reflection. Mrs. Puff paused for a moment, looking at it, then smiled faintly before returning to her writing. Beyond the glass, the ocean was alive in a quieter, slower way. Schools of small fish drifted lazily together, their silver scales catching the last rays of daylight. A jellyfish floated near the boating school's flagpole, pulsing softly as though it too was ready to rest. Even the occasional boat that passed in the distance seemed to move more slowly, more carefully, as if respecting the evening calm. Their horns, usually sharp and startling, echoed in a muted, distant way gentle reminders that the day was ending. Mrs. Puff lifted her head from her diary and took a deep breath. She let it out slowly, the way one exhales before slipping into sleep. Her fins brushed across the diary cover, and she closed it for a moment, resting her eyes. Her mind wandered to the little things she loved about these evenings, the hum of the water pipes settling, the way the wooden beams of the classroom creaked softly as if stretching, the gentle tap-tap of bubbles brushing against the outer walls. She thought about her students, not in the stressful way that teaching sometimes demanded, but with a quiet fondness. SpongeBob's laughter echoed faintly in her memory, not chaotic, not overwhelming, but warm and silly, like a child chasing bubbles in the yard. She thought of the way Squidward sometimes looked bored in the back, and even that thought made her smile. These moments, these students, were pieces of her world. Yet here, in the evening stillness, they softened into something lighter, something easier to carry. She reached for a small lamp at the edge of her desk and clicked it on. The glow was warm and golden, joining the sunset light that was slowly fading outside. Shadows stretched gently across the room, making the boating school feel like a cozy library more than a classroom. She opened her diary again, her pen hovering above the page. Slowly, she wrote about the way the evening light looked against the window, how the water shimmered in soft patterns, how quiet felt like an old friend sitting beside her. Time seemed to move differently in moments like this. The minutes stretched unhurried like waves rolling toward the shore. There was no rush to finish writing. No rush to close the school for the night. Just the calm rhythm of thought and pen breath, and silence. Outside, a small crab scuttled across the sand near the entrance. Mrs. Puff noticed it briefly, watching how it moved without worry, as though it belonged entirely to this stillness. The sight comforted her. The world beyond her classroom was alive, yes, but in harmony with the peaceful evening. She looked around the classroom once more. The rows of seats stood like sentinels, empty but dignified. Each one carried the memory of a student, a laugh, a question, or a daydream. She imagined them all resting now, perhaps at home, safe and quiet. A soft contentment filled her as she thought of it. The day had been long, but the evening was generous. It gave her space. It gave her peace. And as she leaned back in her chair, diary resting gently in her lap, she let herself simply be. No worries, no noise, no pressure. Just Mrs. Puff, her boating school, and the ocean whispering softly through the windows. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated only part of the room, leaving the far corners of the boating school in shadow. Mrs. Puff found comfort in this half-light. It felt like the classroom itself was preparing for sleep, the darkness wrapping around the edges like a blanket. She rested her pen on the page and looked around once more, letting her eyes linger on the details she often overlooked during the busier hours of the day. The chalkboard still bore faint traces of lessons erased earlier, a ghost of circles and arrows that had once explained steering and braking. The sponge that sat in its little tray looked heavy with dust, too tired to be lifted until tomorrow. The flag near the door hung still, unmoving in the hushed evening water. All of it together made the boating school feel alive in its quietness, like it had a soul of its own. Mrs. Puff shifted slightly in her chair, leaning an elbow on the desk as she gazed at the faint orange hues stretching across the water outside. Her thoughts drifted lazily, like the tiny bubbles that rose and popped beyond the glass. She thought about how many sunsets she had seen from this very spot. Hundreds, maybe thousands, each one different, each one beautiful in its own way, yet all of them offering her the same calm reminder that endings could be gentle, that closing the day didn't have to be heavy. She dipped her pen back to the page, the ink flowing slowly as she wrote. "The sea looks tired today," she scribbled in looping letters. "The waves are softer, slower. Even the boat seemed to know it's time to rest." Her handwriting wavered a little as she paused. Then she added, "I feel it too, the slowing down, the letting go." The words gave her a strange kind of relief. She didn't write to be read. She wrote to release. Each line was like setting down a pebble she'd carried in her pocket all day, emptying her hands one small weight at a time. A gentle creak from the building reminded her that the boating school had stood here for years, weathering tides and storms alike. It was strong, steady, reliable. She let herself imagine the school as a living companion, a friend who kept her company, who stood quietly beside her as she taught and as she rested. It wasn't just a place of work. It was a place of rhythm, of memory, of countless days blending into nights just like this. The faint hum of distant sea life reached her ears, a whale's low song carrying from miles away, muffled but comforting. It rose and fell, long and patient, like a lullaby shared across the ocean. Mrs. Puff closed her eyes for a moment, listening. The song mixed with the muted echoes of waves tapping against the foundation of the school, a natural rhythm that eased her shoulders and slowed her breathing. She opened her eyes again and stared at the desk. A stack of papers sat neatly off to the side, boating school quizzes and practice forms that hadn't yet been graded. Normally that pile would have made her sigh, perhaps feel a flicker of stress. But in this moment, under this calm, the papers looked harmless. They could wait until tomorrow. They weren't a burden tonight. Tonight was not for work. Tonight was for peace. Mrs. Puff leaned back in her chair, folding her fins together as she let her gaze drift upward. The ceiling beam stretched above her, lined with small shells that had been caught in the wood over time. Each one seemed like a tiny star against the pale planks, a reminder that beauty often settled quietly into the unnoticed corners of life. She thought about how students sometimes looked up there in boredom during lectures, and the thought made her chuckle softly. Her laughter faded into a gentle sigh, and she returned her eyes to the window. The sun had dipped lower now, the golden tones fading into dusky purples and blues. The water darkened, but it didn't feel frightening. It felt serene. The kind of dark that wrapped itself around you like velvet, the kind of dark that asked you to rest. She picked up her diary again and wrote slowly. It is quiet, so very quiet. I think the ocean wants me to listen. The sound of her pen scratching was the only reply, but it was enough. She imagined the ocean nodding back, agreeing. Outside, the jellyfish from earlier had drifted farther away, its faint glow dimming with the distance. The last streaks of light shimmered like liquid silver before fading, leaving the window filled with cool blue shadows. Mrs. Puff thought of her younger days when evenings like this had seemed endless and mysterious. She remembered lying awake as a young fish, staring out her window, fascinated by how the water changed color as night came. Back then, she wondered what the ocean did at night, if it slept, if it dreamed. Now, years later, she realized it simply rested. It slowed, softened, and hushed, just like she did. The idea made her smile again, gently, like a secret only she and the sea shared. She closed her diary this time and set it aside, folding her fins on the desk. She let her head rest for a moment, eyes half closed, breathing in the salty, calming air. The room seemed to breathe with her. Each exhale matched the slow, settling groan of the building. Each inhale matched the faint whisper of water against the glass. It felt like the whole world had synchronized, like everything inside and outside was part of the same rhythm. And in that rhythm, Mrs. Puff allowed herself to drift. Not into sleep just yet, but into a state between a place of thought and no thought, of presence and distance, where worries couldn't cling and silence felt alive. The ocean outside darkened further, slipping from dusky purple into deep indigo. The boating school was now an island of warm light in a quiet sea, its windows glowing faintly against the shadows. Mrs. Puff reached for a small lantern by the window and lit it with a gentle strike. The flame flickered inside the glass, casting little golden ripples across the walls. The lamp's glow mixed with the steady hum of the ocean, and the room felt softer, warmer, more alive with comfort. She stood from her desk slowly, her body heavy with the weight of the day yet unhurried, as though each movement was part of a ritual. Walking toward the chalkboard, she traced her fin lightly along the edge of the eraser tray. The dust clung to her skin in faint gray smudges, and she rubbed it away absent-mindedly. She didn't mind the mess tonight. Even the imperfections of the classroom seemed soothing, like proof that life had happened here, that time had been spent with purpose. Near the back of the classroom, she paused by the rows of desks. Each one was empty now, but she let her gaze drift across them, as if the students were still there. She imagined SpongeBob at his usual seat, eyes wide with excitement, pencil clutched too tightly, ready to answer before the question was even asked. She imagined Squidward slouched in the corner, indifferent but present, and Patrick leaning back in his chair, not even a student, but somehow always finding his way in. The thought made her smile again. Their energy was chaotic during the day, but at night, their echoes were soft and harmless, like memories that had been gently smoothed over. She touched one of the desks lightly, running her fin along the polished surface. It was cool to the touch, faintly reflecting the golden glow of the lamp behind her. She whispered a quiet good night under her breath, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself, to the students who weren't there, to the lessons that could rest until tomorrow, to the space that had given her both stress and joy in equal measure. The room accepted her whisper in silence. Turning back toward the front, Mrs. Puff crossed to the window once more. Outside, the last hints of light had faded, and stars now glimmered faintly through the water above. They twinkled in small clusters, distorted slightly by the waves, but no less beautiful. Each one seemed to hum softly with its own glow, like tiny promises scattered across the sea. She pressed her fin gently against the glass and let herself feel small in the vastness. Not lonely, never lonely, but small in a comforting way, like a single note in a much larger song. The song of the ocean deepened with the night. The whale's distant call came again, lower this time, almost like a sigh. It carried across the seabed through the currents into her classroom. She closed her eyes and let it fill her chest. The sound was ancient, older than her, older than the boating school, older than the lives of her students. It was timeless, and in its presence, her worries dissolved like sand in the tide. She returned to her desk and carefully placed the diary inside a drawer. Her pen followed, clicking softly against the wood as it settled. The drawer closed with a faint creak, and she smoothed her fins across the desk surface. She knew she would open it again tomorrow, and the act of putting it away felt like a ritual of trust, that the day was complete, that her words were safe, that she could let go until the sun rose again. For a moment she considered leaving. The evening was deep now, and home waited for her not far away. But instead she sat once more, sinking into the chair with a long, drawn-out breath. She wanted to linger. She wanted to give herself more time with the quiet, to savor it like the last sip of warm tea before bed. She leaned her head slightly against her fin and listened again. The ocean beyond the window whispered, its rhythm steady and hypnotic. Bubbles drifted upward, catching the faint glow of her lantern before vanishing into the dark. Every sound, every movement seemed to repeat itself like a lullaby, gentle, familiar, endless. Mrs. Puff thought about her students again, but this time she imagined them all at rest. SpongeBob tucked into his pineapple house, Gary curled on his shell bed beside him, Squidward in his stone home, his clarinet resting quietly against the wall, Sandy in her tree dome, her air clear and still, a book left open by her side, even Patrick under his rock, snoring softly, dreaming of jellyfish or ice cream, each one sleeping, each one safe. The thought filled her with a warmth so deep, it felt like the ocean itself was wrapping around her. She whispered again, this time to herself, "Good night, everyone." Her words melted into the silence, carried away by the gentle hum of the sea. She closed her eyes just for a moment, letting her body sway with the faint current that pressed against the walls. The water had a pulse of its own, steady and timeless, and she allowed herself to sink with it, to be part of it. And there, in the dim glow of the lantern, surrounded by the hush of the sea and the stillness of her classroom, Mrs. Puff lingered in the space between wakefulness and dream. Not asleep, not awake, just resting in the comfort of evening, letting the night unfold around her like a slow, endless wave. The night had now fully embraced Bikini Bottom. Outside the window, the water was no longer tinted by sunset or twilight, but stretched out in a deep, velvety blue. The boating school sat quietly within it, its lantern glow flickering gently like a beacon, though no one was left to notice except the drifting sea life. Mrs. Puff remained at her desk, not hurried, not restless, but completely at ease. Her breathing slowed with the rhythm of the sea. Each inhale matched the faint inward pull of the current, and each exhale matched its gentle release. She found herself swaying slightly, the water rocking her like a cradle. The world beyond her window moved with the same ease, jellyfish glowing like soft lanterns in the distance, starfish clinging calmly to rocks, seaweed bowing gently in the current as though it too was ready for sleep. Mrs. Puff reached down and adjusted her chair, leaning back so her eyes could travel more comfortably across the ceiling beams. She studied the small imperfections in the wood, the tiny cracks, the faint discolorations, and thought about how many years they had been here with her. Each detail seemed like a story carved into the space stories she would never know in full, but which comforted her nonetheless. She thought again of her students, and of how she always worried for them during the chaos of the day. SpongeBob's accidents, Squidward's impatience, the endless energy that filled the classroom. But tonight, those worries didn't weigh on her. They felt far away, softened by the water, reshaped into something gentle. She realized that, in a way, her students were part of why these evenings meant so much. Their noise made the silence sweeter. Their chaos made the calm so precious. And though the classroom was empty now, it still carried their presence in the quietest, most forgiving way. She let her fin rest on the desk, eyes closing as her head tilted slightly forward. For a moment, she imagined herself floating outside with the jellyfish, drifting slowly in the current, glowing softly as the world darkened around her. She imagined the ocean carrying her gently, never rushing, never demanding, just holding her in its endless embrace. The thought soothed her until she nearly dozed, her breaths deep and even. A faint creak from the building stirred her awake again, though not unpleasantly. She smiled softly to herself, realizing she had nearly slipped into sleep. She reached for her diary once more, though not to write this time. Instead, she simply held it, the weight of it familiar in her fins. She traced the frayed edges of the cover and whispered a small promise to herself. Tomorrow will come, and I'll be ready. But tonight is for resting. She placed the diary back down and rose slowly, her body heavy but comfortable. Moving toward the window, she pressed her fins gently against the glass again. The stars above shimmered faintly through the ocean, their light soft and distant, but still finding its way down to her little classroom. She felt connected to them, to the stars, to the sea, to the steady heartbeat of the night itself. Mrs. Puff turned back and took one last look at the boating school before leaving. The desks stood silently in their neat rows. The chalkboard waited patiently for tomorrow. The lantern glowed like a guardian, keeping a watch until morning. It was all as it should be, calm and steady. She whispered once more, "Good night," to the room, her words gentle and sincere. She walked toward the door slowly, each step measured, her fins brushing softly against the wooden floor. When she reached the doorway, she paused, hand on the frame, and looked back. The classroom looked almost dreamlike in the dim glow, the shadows soft and forgiving, the quiet absolute. She knew she would return tomorrow to noise and laughter and worry, but tonight, this peace belonged entirely to her. As she stepped outside, the water felt cooler against her skin. The night spread out in all directions, vast but calm, infinite but quiet. The boating school behind her stood glowing faintly, a little island of warmth in the deep. She drifted a few steps away, watching the building fade slightly in the distance, its outline softened by the water. She carried the image with her, tucking it into her heart as part of the night's memory. Her walk home was slow and thoughtful. The sand beneath her fins was soft, giving slightly under her weight with each step. Tiny shells scattered across the path glimmered faintly in the starlight, and the sound of her movement blended with the whisper of the tide. She passed familiar sights, coral arches swaying gently, small fish darting into shadows, the occasional bubble rising and popping near the surface. Each detail added to the lull of the night, each one reminding her of the stillness that surrounded everything. She thought again about the meaning of evenings like this. They weren't just pauses between busy days. They were gifts, moments that stretched wider than the hours they filled, moments that reminded her that peace wasn't found in silence alone, but in choosing to notice it. She smiled faintly as the thought settled, realizing she had always known it, deep down, even on her busiest days. By the time she reached her home, the night was nearly complete. The stars shone faintly above, their light steady, while the ocean rocked with a gentle pulse that would carry her into rest. She unlocked her door, stepped inside, and felt the familiar comfort of her own little space. The air was warmer here, the furniture arranged just as she liked it, the small details of her life waiting for her. She took one last glance out the window at the sea, then closed the curtain softly, shutting out the world for the night. And as she settled into her own chair, fins resting gently in her lap, Mrs. Puff exhaled with ease. The day had ended. The classroom had rested. The ocean had sung its song. And now, in the quiet of her home, she allowed herself to drift fully into the peace she had carried with her all evening. The night would hold her. The sea would guard her. And by the time the morning light returned, she would be ready to begin again. The night deepened around Bikini Bottom, and Mrs. Puff found herself at home, sitting by the window of her cozy little living room. The lamps were dimmed low, casting a soft golden glow across the walls, and outside the sea shimmered with a faint silvery light from the moon above. The boating school was behind her now, but the calm she had carried from that quiet evening still lingered, resting gently in her heart. She sat in a comfortable armchair near the window, a small cup of tea cooling slowly in her fins. The steam curled upward, disappearing into the still air of her home, and she breathed it in with a quiet sigh. The warmth of the cup soothed her, as though it was reminding her that she was safe, that the day was done. Her eyes drifted out the window. The sea outside was darker now, the sand almost invisible under the velvet blue water. A school of tiny, glowing fish passed by, leaving trails of pale light that reminded her of falling stars. She watched them for a long time, letting her mind wander where it wished. Inevitably, her thoughts returned to SpongeBob. They always did. During the day, she often worried about him, about his endless energy, his reckless attempts at steering, the constant accidents that left her sighing or hiding behind her fins. But now, at night, when the sea was calm and the world was quiet, those memories felt softer. They no longer weighed her down. Instead, they floated through her mind like bubbles rising upward, light and harmless. She chuckled softly to herself as she remembered one of his latest attempts, the way his little sponge hands gripped the wheel too tightly, the way his big, eager eyes stared ahead, and the inevitable crash that followed. During the day, it had left her frazzled. But tonight, in the glow of the moonlight, the memory seemed almost sweet. There was something endearing about his determination, something innocent and pure in his refusal to give up. She leaned back in her chair, setting the teacup gently on the table beside her. The quiet tick of a small seashell-shaped clock filled the silence. She let her fins rest on her lap and closed her eyes. For a moment, she allowed herself to reflect not only on SpongeBob, but on all her students over the years. So many faces, so many voices, some confident, some shy, some quick to learn, others slower, but all of them bringing their own spark into her classroom. Teaching was never easy, but in nights like this, she was reminded of why she had chosen it, to guide, to nurture, to share knowledge. And while SpongeBob might never master boating in the way she expected, he still taught her something in return: patience, resilience, and the strange beauty of laughter even in chaos. The thought warmed her heart, and she smiled gently, her eyes still closed. The ocean outside hummed faintly, a natural lullaby that seemed to agree with her. She opened her eyes again and looked at the faint reflections on the glass, her own face layered with the night sea beyond. For a moment, it felt like she was staring into two worlds at once, the present and the memories drifting just behind her eyes. Her gaze softened. She thought about how easy it was to focus on worry, on stress, on things that seemed too heavy during the day. But here, at night, in this quiet space, those things no longer held power. Instead, what remained was gratitude. Gratitude for the students she had met. Gratitude for the chance to teach, even when it was hard. Gratitude for the calm, like this, that reminded her she was not alone. Mrs. Puff reached for a small photo frame that rested on the table beside her cup. It was an old picture, edges slightly faded, of her standing outside the boating school years ago. She was younger then, full of energy and optimism. And though she looked different, the spark in her eyes was the same. She traced the frame with her fin, letting a smile spread slowly across her face. Still here, she whispered softly to herself. Still teaching, still trying, still moving forward. The clock ticked on, steady and reassuring. She placed the photo back down and leaned into the chair, her body sinking comfortably into the cushions. Outside, the glowing fish had gone, but now a jellyfish drifted near the window, its soft blue glow pulsing like a heartbeat. She watched it for a long time, mesmerized by its slow, gentle movements. It reminded her of her own breath, steady, patient, never rushed. She thought of SpongeBob again, this time imagining him asleep in his pineapple home. She pictured him curled up in bed, blanket pulled tight, Gary beside him. His face, usually full of energy and excitement, would be relaxed in slumber, his dreams surely filled with more adventures. The image brought her peace. It reminded her that even the most restless spirits found rest eventually. Mrs. Puff sighed, but it was not a sigh of weariness. It was the sigh of someone letting go, of someone who had carried her day as far as it needed to go. She let the sound drift into the quiet, blending with the hum of the sea. And as she closed her eyes again, she let herself sink into her reflections, not sharp, not painful, but softened like sea glass polished by time. The night air inside her home seemed to grow even calmer, as Mrs. Puff let her reflections settle like sand drifting to the ocean floor. The tea on the table had cooled completely now, but she didn't mind. Its presence, even untouched, was enough a small ritual of comfort, a reminder that she had carved this moment of peace for herself. She turned her gaze upward toward the ceiling beams of her living room. Shadows danced softly there, shifting with the flicker of her lamp. They reminded her of the slow sway of kelp forests in the current, moving endlessly yet without urgency. She watched them for a while, letting her thoughts wander like the drifting kelp. She thought of her younger days as a teacher, the nervousness of her very first class, the way she'd tried so hard to sound confident, the hopeful spark in the eyes of her first group of students. She had worried then if she was good enough, if she could truly guide them, if she could bear the weight of responsibility. And yet, year after year, she found herself still here, still teaching, still caring. The fear had faded, but the hope remained. It was quieter now, softened with age, but it was still there, and she carried it like a lantern through her life. Her fins traced the arm of the chair, moving slowly, thoughtfully. She reflected on the way time seemed to shift depending on how she held it. During the day, it always felt hurried bells ringing, students rushing, mistakes piling up faster than she could correct them. But in the evenings, time stretched wide, like the horizon itself. Each second felt like its own tide rolling in, unhurried, unbroken, eternal. Her eyes drifted once again to the window. The jellyfish was gone now, but in its place, faint shadows of larger fish passed in the distance, their outlines moving slowly, gracefully, like pieces of a dream. Their presence was reassuring, like distant companions on the same quiet journey. She felt connected to them, to all of the sea that lived and breathed beyond her home. Mrs. Puff folded her fins together and let herself remember some of SpongeBob's brighter moments. He was not only chaotic, after all. Sometimes his joy brought a lightness into the room no one else could manage. She remembered the way his laughter could spread to others, even in the midst of disaster. She remembered how determined he always was, no matter how many times he failed. That kind of spirit was rare, she realized, and even though it tested her patience, it also taught her something valuable. "Maybe he'll surprise me one day," she whispered with a faint smile. The thought was not a hope for perfection, but for the simple joy of seeing him succeed, even once after so many attempts. It wasn't impossible. It was just a matter of time. Her mind wandered further, reflecting on how she often measured herself by her struggles as a teacher. But here, in the quiet, she saw it differently. She saw her life as a series of moments, some chaotic, some calm, all woven together into something meaningful. Even the mistakes, even the frustrations, they shaped her just as much as the triumphs did. The thought eased her heart, and she let her shoulders relax fully into the chair. A faint current brushed against the walls of her home, making a soft hum that filled the silence. Mrs. Puff listened, her eyes half closed, and let it soothe her. She thought about how the sea itself was always moving, always shifting, never still. And yet, in its movement, there was a deeper stillness, a rhythm that remained steady no matter how the currents changed. It reminded her of her own heart, always beating, always moving her forward, even when she doubted herself. She looked at the clock again. Time had passed slowly, but steadily. The hands moved with patience, marking each moment with a soft tick that blended seamlessly with the ocean's song. She thought about how often she ignored time during the day, wishing it would speed up or slow down. Tonight, she welcomed it exactly as it was. Her eyes softened again as she returned to her reflection in the glass. She studied her own face, layered against the night sea beyond. She didn't look as young as she once had, and her fins showed the faint wear of years. But she also saw strength there, a strength she often forgot to acknowledge. She saw kindness in her eyes, even when they carried worry. She saw someone who had given her life to helping others, and though it had not always been easy, it had always been worth it. The thought brought a kind of peace she hadn't realized she needed. She reached for the photo again, her younger self smiling back at her from the frame. This time, she didn't just see the hopeful energy of the past, she saw continuity. She saw how that young version of herself had grown, how she had carried her purpose forward, how she had never given up. She whispered softly, "Thank you," to the version of herself in the photo, as if acknowledging the effort it had taken to become who she was now. The sea outside shifted again, and a faint streak of moonlight cut through the water, shining across her window. The glow touched her reflection, merging her face with the soft silver of the ocean. For a moment, she felt like she was both within her home and outside in the sea, part of something larger than herself. It was humbling, but also reassuring. She closed her eyes once more, letting the memory of her day blur into the calm of the night. She reflected not on the difficulties, but on the gentleness hidden within them, the lessons she carried, the gratitude she felt. Her breath slowed further, and the steady hum of the ocean became the only sound she needed. The quiet of the evening deepened as the world outside slowed to its most delicate rhythm. Mrs. Puff shifted slightly in her chair, drawing a soft blanket over her fins. The fabric brushed against her gently, warm and familiar, grounding her in this moment of stillness. She thought of how rare it was to sit without demand, to let her thoughts wander without interruption. There was a sweetness in it, like the softness of seagrass brushing her fins on a calm swim. Her gaze lingered on the window, and she noticed how the ocean outside had turned darker, a velvety blue stretching endlessly into the night. Small dots of bioluminescence pulsed in the distance, tiny creatures shimmering like stars caught in the water. She watched them flicker and fade, each pulse a reminder that beauty often lived in the smallest, most fleeting details. She thought again of SpongeBob, but this time her mind rested on the quiet moments he sometimes shared. Not the chaos of his lessons, not the panic that filled her days, but the rare glimpses of his innocence when he was calm. She recalled one morning when he had arrived unusually early, standing at the edge of the boating school dock as the sun rose. He hadn't noticed her watching, but she had seen him take a deep breath, smiling at the simple wonder of a new day. In that moment, she had felt something soften inside her, a recognition that beneath all the noise, he was a soul full of hope. Her fins traced slow circles against the blanket as if sketching the memory in the air. She realized how often her frustrations overshadowed her gratitude. Tonight, though, she let herself feel the gratitude fully, without resistance. She was grateful for her students, even the difficult ones. She was grateful for her work, even when it exhausted her. She was grateful for the rhythm of her life, uneven though it may be. The thought brought her mind back to the photo of herself as a young teacher. She reached for it again, holding it carefully in her fins. Looking into her own younger eyes, she felt a kinship across time. That version of herself had been nervous, yes, but she had also been brave. Brave enough to choose a life of patience and teaching. Brave enough to trust she could make a difference. Mrs. Puff pressed the frame gently against her chest, closing her eyes for a long moment. The weight of it was light, but the meaning was immense. A sigh escaped her lips, but it wasn't the sigh of weariness she so often gave during the day. It was the sigh of release, of letting go, of resting in acceptance. The kind of sigh that came when she stopped fighting herself and simply allowed the night to cradle her. She set the photo back on the table and leaned into the chair once more. The sounds of the ocean wrapped around her, a slow swell of currents. The occasional creak of her home as it shifted gently in the tide. The distant call of a sea creature echoing across the dark. Each sound layered together like a lullaby, steady and eternal. Her thoughts drifted toward her dreams. She wondered what they would hold tonight. Would she dream of boating school, or of wide-open seas with no students in sight? Would she dream of quiet gardens of kelp swaying endlessly in the current, or perhaps of gentle walks along the sand where the water was always calm? Dreams, she thought, were their own kind of reflection, the mind's way of holding up a mirror to what lived beneath the surface. She smiled faintly at the thought, already comforted by the possibility. The lamp beside her flickered slightly, and she tilted her head to watch. The flame inside the bulb wavered like a heartbeat, steadying again after a moment. It reminded her of her own resilience. She had flickered. Yes, there were days when she felt near her limit, when she thought she could not endure another chaotic moment. But she had steadied too. Always she had found her way back to center. The reflection gave her strength, and her chest swelled softly with pride, though she kept her expression calm. The ocean beyond grew darker still, the last traces of twilight swallowed by the deep. The glowing specks of bioluminescence became more vivid, filling the water with a constellation of living light. Mrs. Puff leaned forward slightly, enchanted. For a moment she felt like she was gazing into the night sky itself, infinite and unbroken. She whispered softly to herself, "Beautiful," as if speaking the word might anchor the image in her memory forever. Her eyes grew heavier, her body sinking deeper into the chair. She thought of how the night was like a teacher of its own kind, gentle, patient, endless in its wisdom. It reminded her that not everything needed answers, not every worry needed solving. Some things were meant to be felt, to be held in stillness, to be reflected on quietly until they dissolved into peace. Mrs. Puff folded her fins together once more and let her breathing deepen. Each inhale matched the rhythm of the currents, each exhale like a soft wave breaking on shore. Her reflections had carried her far, but they had also brought her home to herself, home to the quiet, home to the gentle truth that life, even with its chaos, was full of beauty worth cherishing. And so she sat, half awake, half dreaming, a solitary figure bathed in the glow of her lamp and the shimmer of the sea, drifting in her reflections like a boat carried gently by the tide. The night stretched on, quiet and unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world to hold her. Mrs. Puff sat very still, her fins folded gently in her lap. The blanket draped across her like a second skin. The hum of the ocean surrounded her, steady and protective, and she allowed herself to drift deeper into its embrace. Her mind, though calmer now, still traced gentle loops through memory and thought. She found herself returning once more to the students she had guided over the years. So many names, so many faces, each carrying their own hopes and fears into her classroom. Some had learned quickly, others had stumbled, and a few had given up entirely. Yet each one had left a mark on her, small but lasting, like the faint etchings of shells on the seafloor. She smiled faintly as she remembered the shyest of her students, a small fish who could barely look at the wheel without trembling. Day after day, she had coaxed him forward, never rushing, never judging. And one day, when he finally steered the boat across the practice lagoon without faltering, the joy on his face had been brighter than any sunbeam. That moment had reminded her why she endured all the frustration, why she chose this life. She carried that memory like a pearl, polished over time into something precious. Her thoughts then shifted back to SpongeBob. He was different from the others, so full of energy, so desperate to succeed, so endlessly optimistic even in failure. He was exhausting, yes, but he was also unique. She considered, for perhaps the 100th time, what made him so persistent. Most would have given up after so many failures, yet he returned again and again with the same boundless enthusiasm. There was a strange kind of wisdom in that persistence, a lesson she sometimes overlooked. Perhaps, she thought, the world needed souls like his reminders that trying mattered more than perfection. Her reflections softened, and she felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest. Maybe her role wasn't just to teach driving. Maybe it was also to hold space for hope, to witness the resilience of her students, and to remind herself of the many ways success could appear. It wasn't always in a perfect turn or a flawless stop. Sometimes it was in laughter after a mistake, or in the courage to try again. These were successes too, though they couldn't always be graded or written down. The lamp beside her dimmed slightly, its glow turning amber, as though it too were ready for rest. Mrs. Puff adjusted it, watching the shadows shift once more across her walls. The shapes stretched long and soft, curving like the gentle waves outside. She thought about how even shadows had their beauty, revealing forms she might otherwise overlook. Reflections weren't only in glass. She realized they were in light and shadow, in memory and dream. In every quiet place the heart wandered. She rose slowly from her chair, stretching her fins with a soft sigh. The room welcomed the movement, the floor creaking gently beneath her steps. She moved toward the window again, placing both fins against the cool glass. Outside, the bioluminescent creatures still glowed, scattered like a constellation across the deep. She traced imaginary lines between them, connecting the dots as though they were stars. In her mind, they became patterns: a boat, a seashell, a lantern. Each shape told a story, and each story reminded her that she was part of something much larger than herself. "Peaceful," she whispered. The word floated into the night, carried away by the currents. She imagined it spreading outward, touching the creatures, the waves, even the distant students who might be asleep in their homes. The thought filled her with a strange serenity, as though her quiet could ripple far beyond her walls. She returned to her chair, settling in again with the blanket wrapped more snugly around her. This time she let her eyes close fully, though her thoughts still drifted. She imagined herself as one of those glowing specks outside, small but bright in the darkness. She imagined her worries dissolving into the sea, carried away by the current, leaving only light behind. Her breathing slowed. The room seemed to hush itself in response, the ticking clock softening, the hum of the ocean deepening into something almost like a lullaby. She was still awake, but only just. Her mind balanced at the edge of dreaming. She thought again of her reflection, of the young teacher she once was, and the seasoned one she had become. Both were true, both were part of her, and both deserved her kindness. As she drifted closer to sleep, she whispered a final thought to herself. "I am enough." The words were gentle, almost a secret, but they carried the weight of truth. She felt them settle inside her, grounding her, comforting her, guiding her toward rest. Her head tilted against the chair, her fins slackening beneath the blanket. The glow of the lamp shimmered faintly, then steadied, casting one last halo of light around her. Outside, the sea pulsed softly with bioluminescence, a living reflection of her inner calm. And slowly, as her breath deepened and her thoughts grew still, Mrs. Puff slipped fully into the quiet, carried tenderly into dreams by the endless, gentle sea. The night in Bikini Bottom was quiet, as though the entire town had drawn a blanket over itself. Shops were shuttered, lights dimmed, and the streets, usually buzzing with chatter and activity, now hummed with only the soft whispers of the sea. It was in this calm, under the faint glow of bioluminescent street lamps, that Mrs. Puff decided to take her evening walk. She stepped out of her cozy home, closing the door behind her with care so as not to disturb the stillness. A gentle current brushed against her as she moved, carrying with it the faint scent of kelp and coral. The streets stretched before her, empty and inviting, paved with sand that shimmered faintly in the moonlight filtering down from the surface above. Mrs. Puff wrapped her shawl more tightly around herself and began walking at an unhurried pace. Each step pressed softly into the sand, leaving temporary impressions that the current quickly erased. There was something comforting in that rhythm, the way her steps left a trace, only to be carried away, like thoughts passing quietly through her mind. The first landmark she passed was the boating school itself. Though she had left it behind earlier in the evening, she found herself drawn to it again, standing at the edge of the familiar dock. The building was dark now, its windows reflecting only the pale light of the sea. Without the usual sound of SpongeBob's laughter or the rumble of struggling engines, it seemed transformed, no longer a place of chaos, but a structure of calm, floating gently in the water. She paused for a moment, resting her fins on the railing, and let the memories of the day dissolve into the silence of the night. Leaving the school behind, she continued down the road. The jellyfish fields stretched faintly into the distance, the horizon dotted with glowing specks of drifting creatures. Their soft, pulsing light gave the field the look of a dreamscape, endless and serene. Mrs. Puff smiled faintly at the sight, reminded of her youth when she too had wandered through those fields, watching the jellyfish drift like living lanterns. She didn't enter tonight, but she let the vision settle in her heart as she walked past, carrying its glow with her. The road curved gently, leading her past Squidward's house. His window was lit faintly, and the muffled sound of a clarinet floated into the street. The tune was slow, almost mournful, but carried a beauty that matched the stillness of the evening. Mrs. Puff stopped for a moment, tilting her head to listen more closely. Squidward's music was often overlooked in the bustle of the day, drowned out by SpongeBob and Patrick's antics. But here, in the quiet of the night, his playing was a gift, a soft offering to anyone willing to listen. Mrs. Puff closed her eyes and allowed the melody to wash over her, the notes rising and falling like gentle waves. She continued on once the music faded, her fins moving in rhythm with the lingering tune. Soon she passed by Patrick's rock. It was closed firmly, but the sound of a deep, contented snore drifted from within. Mrs. Puff chuckled softly to herself, the sound barely more than a whisper. Patrick, in his simplicity, often embodied a peace she envied. He worried little, cared deeply when he did, and rested without hesitation. In his own way, he had mastered the art of being. Further down, she came upon SpongeBob's pineapple. The house glowed warmly, its windows lit like beacons in the night. From within, she could hear the faint hum of SpongeBob's voice, perhaps singing to himself as he prepared for bed. The sound was cheerful even in its quietness, and Mrs. Puff felt her heart soften again. Though he was her most challenging student, there was a purity to him that the world seemed to need. She stood at the edge of his yard for a moment, listening, smiling faintly at his simple joy. The road carried her beyond the homes of her students and colleagues, into the quieter stretches of Bikini Bottom. The coral buildings stood like silhouettes in the dim light, their outlines softened by the currents. Street lamps glowed every few paces, their orbs casting halos of pale green and blue that rippled gently as the water shifted around them. She walked through these pools of light slowly, as though each one was its own small world, inviting her to linger. Mrs. Puff's thoughts were calm now, her earlier reflections settling into her heart like treasures tucked safely away. Each landmark she passed reminded her that this town, for all its chaos, also held peace. It was a balance she sometimes forgot in the noise of the day, but one she cherished on nights like this. She breathed deeply, letting the salt of the ocean fill her lungs, and exhaled into the quiet, her steps carrying her further into the embrace of the sleeping town. As she walked, she noticed a small school of fish gliding by overhead, their scales catching the glow of the lamps. They moved in perfect unison, weaving patterns through the water, each turn and shift executed with grace. She stopped to watch them, marveling at how effortlessly they moved together, as if guided by a shared heartbeat. It was a reminder, she thought, of how harmony was possible even in a world of so many different currents. With the sight lingering in her mind, Mrs. Puff resumed her walk. The street stretched onward, empty but alive with subtle beauty, the kind that only revealed itself to those who moved slowly enough to notice. Tonight, she was one of those few, and it filled her with a quiet gratitude she could not put into words. The current along the main road carried Mrs. Puff gently as she walked, almost as if the sea itself wanted to make her journey easier. She let it guide her, her fins swaying slightly with each step. The silence of the town was not emptiness, but fullness filled with the hum of life resting, with the whisper of currents brushing coral walls, with the faint glow of distant homes where laughter and conversation had long since quieted into sleep. Mrs. Puff passed by the Krusty Krab. Its neon sign was dark, the bold letters resting after a long day of announcing themselves to the world. Through the windows, she could just make out the booths and tables, neatly arranged, waiting for morning customers. She stood there for a while, her eyes drawn to the counter where SpongeBob would usually bounce with energy, flipping patties as if each one was his masterpiece. Even now, with the restaurant closed, she could almost hear the echoes of his cheerfulness. The memory made her smile, and for a brief moment she imagined what it must feel like to carry that kind of joy so constantly. Beside the Krusty Krab sat the chum bucket, dark and quiet as well. Its looming mechanical figure looked less menacing under the gentle wash of moonlight. Mrs. Puff thought briefly of Plankton and his endless schemes. Even he, she imagined, was probably asleep now, dreaming of impossible victories. The thought softened her, and she realized that even those who seemed perpetually restless also had their moments of stillness. Perhaps, in some strange way, the night united them all, giving every creature, big or small, a chance to pause. She continued her walk, her steps carrying her beyond the commercial center into the older part of town. Here the buildings leaned a little closer together, their coral walls worn by years of currents and time. The streets narrowed, and the lamps stood farther apart, casting longer shadows that seemed to sway with the sea. Mrs. Puff slowed her pace, not out of caution, but to take in the quiet charm of this part of Bikini Bottom. She loved how history lived here, etched into every faded wall and cracked shell stone path. At one corner she passed a small flower stand, closed now, with its display carefully tucked away for the night. She remembered buying flowers from it once, long ago, to decorate her classroom for a special event. The memory of students walking into the room filled with color returned to her vividly, and she smiled softly. Those small gestures, she thought, had always mattered more than she realized at the time. A little further along, Mrs. Puff noticed a familiar figure. Old Man Walker sat on a bench beneath one of the glowing lamps, his eyes half closed as though caught between wakefulness and sleep. He looked peaceful, his cane resting beside him. Mrs. Puff raised a fin in a polite greeting as she passed, and though his eyes didn't fully open, he gave a slow, gentle nod. The exchange was brief, but it warmed her heart. Even in the stillness, there was connection, small acknowledgments that reminded her she was not alone in her walk. The road bent again, leading her toward the outskirts of town. Here the houses grew sparser, the seaweed gardens wider, the silence deeper. Mrs. Puff inhaled the scent of the gardens, earthy and fresh, as it mingled with the salt water. Tiny creatures rustled softly among the stalks, their movements like whispers in the night. She thought about how life went on quietly in every corner of the sea, most of it unseen, unnoticed, but always present. It was humbling, and it filled her with a sense of belonging to something vast and interconnected. As she passed one garden, a gentle glow caught her attention. A cluster of luminescent sea flowers had opened, their petals shimmering like lanterns. She stepped closer, marveling at the soft light they cast on the sand. The glow seemed almost magical, as if the flowers themselves were offering her a moment of beauty to carry with her. She bent slightly, studying their delicate shapes, and whispered a thank you into the water, as though the flowers could hear her gratitude. Her path eventually led her to a quiet overlook, a place where the sandy road ended at a small cliff, dropping off into the open sea. Mrs. Puff stood at the edge, gazing out into the vastness before her. The ocean stretched infinitely, its depths shimmering faintly under the moonlight. She could see schools of fish moving like drifting clouds, their collective bodies shifting and scattering as though painting patterns across the water. The sight filled her chest with awe, reminding her of the grandeur of the world beyond the borders of town. She rested her fins on the edge of the railing and leaned forward slightly. The water here was cooler, the current stronger, carrying with it a refreshing bite. It swept through her like a cleansing breath, carrying away the last traces of the day's worries. She closed her eyes, letting the current brush against her, imagining it smoothing away her stress the way waves smooth rough stones. For a long moment, Mrs. Puff simply stood there, listening to the silence of the open sea. It was not an empty silence, but a full one, brimming with life she could not see but knew was there. Creatures stirring in the deep, corals shifting with the tides, currents weaving invisible threads through it all. It reminded her of how much existed beyond her view, beyond her small circle of life, and yet how connected she remained to it all. When she finally turned back toward town, her steps were slower, gentler, as though she carried the vastness of that view inside her. Each street lamp she passed now felt like a star guiding her home, each shadow like a companion walking quietly at her side. The town was not just a place of work and chaos. Tonight, it was a sanctuary, a reminder that even within the routines of her days, there were moments of deep, unshakable peace. The current along the main road carried Mrs. Puff gently as she walked, almost as if the sea itself wanted to make her journey easier. She let it guide her, her fins swaying slightly with each step. The silence of the town was not emptiness, but fullness, filled with the hum of life resting, with the whisper of currents brushing coral walls, with the faint glow of distant homes where laughter and conversation had long since quieted into sleep. Mrs. Puff passed by the Krusty Krab. Its neon sign was dark, the bold letters resting after a long day of announcing themselves to the world. Through the windows, she could just make out the booths and tables, neatly arranged, waiting for morning customer. She stood there for a while, her eyes drawn to the counter where SpongeBob would usually bounce with energy, flipping patties as if each one was his masterpiece. Even now, with the restaurant closed, she could almost hear the echoes of his cheerfulness. The memory made her smile, and for a brief moment, she imagined what it must feel like to carry that kind of joy so constantly. Beside the Krusty Krab sat the Chum Bucket, dark and quiet as well. Its looming, mechanical figure looked less menacing under the gentle wash of moonlight. Mrs. Puff thought briefly of Plankton and his endless schemes. Even he, she imagined, was probably asleep now, dreaming of impossible victories. The thought softened her, and she realized that even those who seemed perpetually restless also had their moments of stillness. Perhaps in some strange way, the night united them all, giving every creature, big or small, a chance to pause. She continued her walk, her steps carrying her beyond the commercial center into the older part of town. Here the buildings leaned a little closer together, their coral walls worn by years of currents and time. The streets narrowed, and the lamps stood farther apart, casting longer shadows that seemed to sway with the sea. Mrs. Puff slowed her pace, not out of caution, but to take in the quiet charm of this part of Bikini Bottom. She loved how history lived here, etched into every faded wall and cracked shell-stone path. At one corner, she passed a small flower stand, closed now, with its display carefully tucked away for the night. She remembered buying flowers from it once, long ago, to decorate her classroom for a special event. The memory of students walking into the room filled with the color returned to her vividly, and she smiled softly. Those small gestures, she thought, had always mattered more than she realized at the time. A little further along, Mrs. Puff noticed a familiar figure. Old Man Walker sat on a bench beneath one of the glowing lamps, his eyes half closed as though caught between wakefulness and sleep. He looked peaceful, his cane resting beside him. Mrs. Puff raised a fin in a polite greeting as she passed, and though his eyes didn't fully open, he gave a slow, gentle nod. The exchange was brief, but it warmed her heart. Even in the stillness, there was connection, small acknowledgments that reminded her she was not alone in her walk. The road bent again, leading her toward the outskirts of town. Here the houses grew sparser, the seaweed gardens wider, the silence deeper. Mrs. Puff inhaled the scent of the gardens, earthy and fresh, as it mingled with the salt water. Tiny creatures rustled softly among the stalks, their movements like whispers in the night. She thought about how life went on quietly in every corner of the sea, most of it unseen, unnoticed, but always present. It was humbling, and it filled her with a sense of belonging to something vast and interconnected. As she passed one garden, a gentle glow caught her attention. A cluster of luminescent sea flowers had opened, their petals shimmering like lanterns. She stepped closer, marveling at the soft light they cast on the sand. The glow seemed almost magical, as if the flowers themselves were offering her a moment of beauty to carry with her. She bent slightly, studying their delicate shapes, and whispered a thank you into the water, as though the flowers could hear her gratitude. Her path eventually led her to a quiet overlook, a place where the sandy road ended at a small cliff, dropping off into the open sea. Mrs. Puff stood at the edge, gazing out into the vastness before her. The ocean stretched infinitely, its depths shimmering faintly under the moonlight. She could see schools of fish moving like drifting clouds, their collective bodies shifting and scattering as though painting patterns across the water. The sight filled her chest with awe, reminding her of the grandeur of the world beyond the borders of town. She rested her fins on the edge of the railing and leaned forward slightly. The water here was cooler, the current stronger, carrying with it a refreshing bite. It swept through her like a cleansing breath, carrying away the last traces of the day's worries. She closed her eyes, letting the current brush against her, imagining it smoothing away her stress the way waves smoothed rough stones. For a long moment, Mrs. Puff simply stood there, listening to the silence of the open sea. It was not an empty silence, but a full one, brimming with life she could not see, but knew was there, creatures stirring in the deep, corals shifting with the tides, currents weaving invisible threads through it all. It reminded her of how much existed, beyond her view, beyond her small circle of life, and yet how connected she remained to it all. When she finally turned back toward town, her steps were slower, gentler, as though she carried the vastness of that view inside her. Each street lamp she passed now felt like a star guiding her home, each shadow like a companion walking quietly at her side. The town was not just a place of work and chaos. Tonight, it was a sanctuary, a reminder that even within the routines of her days, there were moments of deep, unshakable peace. The currents carried Mrs. Puff back toward the familiar streets that led to her neighborhood. The soft hush of the ocean around her felt like a companion now, moving alongside her as she walked. The lamps above gave off a faint, golden glow, and their light shifted gently with the tide, casting moving shadows that reminded her of dreams drifting across the seabed. She passed by the library, its shell-shaped exterior resting quietly, windows darkened. During the day, the library buzzed with the quiet shuffle of readers, the turning of pages, and the soft murmur of the librarian. Tonight it stood still, filled with the silence of countless books waiting to be opened. Mrs. Puff imagined the stories resting within those walls, adventures, histories, poems all waiting patiently for another day. It comforted her to know that even in silence, knowledge and imagination waited, just as the town itself seemed to wait for the dawn. Not far from the library was a small playground. Mrs. Puff paused at its edge, looking at the swings that hung perfectly still, their chains glimmering faintly in the moonlight. The slide curved gracefully downward, untouched, and the sandbox sat quietly, no small fins or claws digging into it. She thought about the students she had taught, their laughter, their boundless energy. She pictured them here in the daylight, chasing each other, playing games, filling the space with joy. And then she looked at the empty playground under the moon and felt a different kind of joy, the quiet kind. The kind that came from knowing that the world, even when still, was full of life and promise. She continued her walk, taking a turn that led her into a quiet residential lane. Here the houses were spaced farther apart, each surrounded by its own little garden. The gardens glowed with bioluminescent seaweed and flowers, their soft lights twinkling like stars scattered across the ground. Mrs. Puff walked slowly, admiring each one. She noticed how some families had placed little shells along their pathways, polished smooth and neatly arranged. Others had a lantern swaying from hooks, each one glowing with its own warmth. These small touches spoke of care, of people shaping their homes with love. A soft sound reached her ears, the strum of a guitar. She looked toward one house and saw a young fish sitting on the porch playing quietly, his eyes half closed in the music. The melody was gentle, flowing like the tide, blending perfectly with the night. Mrs. Puff didn't linger too long, not wanting to intrude, but the music followed her as she walked away, adding another layer of beauty to her journey. It reminded her that even in stillness, creativity found its way into the night. Soon she came upon a small hill, not high, but enough to give her a view of the town. She climbed it slowly, her fins brushing against the sand, and when she reached the top, she paused to take in the sight. Bikini Bottom stretched out below her, its streets winding like veins, its lamps glowing like tiny constellations. The houses, the shops, the plazas, all were wrapped in a blanket of peace. Mrs. Puff stood there quietly, her heart swelling with appreciation. She realized that this was what she loved most about her town. Not just its lively chaos, but the hidden stillness it offered when the world slowed down. She stayed there for a while, breathing deeply, letting the view sink into her. The night sky above shimmered faintly, light filtering through the water in silvery streams. A few jellyfish floated lazily in the distance, their bodies glowing like lanterns drifting across the horizon. The sight filled her with awe, reminding her once again of how vast and wondrous the ocean truly was. When she finally began her descent from the hill, her steps were unhurried, as though she wanted to carry the peace with her for as long as she could. The streets grew quieter the closer she came to her home, the lamps fewer, the shadows longer. She welcomed the darkness, for it felt like a soft blanket wrapping the town in rest. At last, Mrs. Puff reached her street. Her little home sat at the end, its round shape outlined gently in the glow of a single lantern. She paused at her gate, taking one last look over her shoulder at the town behind her, the streets she had walked, and the sights she had seen, the silence she had shared. All of it felt like a gift the night had given her. She whispered a soft thank you into the water, her voice carried away by the current. Opening her gate, she stepped into her garden. The flowers there glowed faintly, swaying in the tide as though greeting her return. She smiled at them, feeling as if they were welcoming her home. With slow, gentle movements, she entered her house, closing the door behind her. The familiar warmth of her home wrapped around her, but the peace of the night stayed within her heart. Before heading to bed, she glanced out her window one last time. The town lay still, the lamps glowing faintly in the distance, the ocean whispering its lullaby. Mrs. Puff took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, and whispered to herself, what a beautiful night. And with that she turned away, her steps light, her spirit calm. The peaceful walk had ended, but its quiet gift remained, cradling her as she moved into the next moment of her gentle evening. The door to her home closed softly behind her, sealing away the streets of Bikini Bottom. Inside, the water felt warmer, gentler, like the familiar embrace of a blanket. Mrs. Puff slipped off her shawl and hung it carefully on a hook by the door. Her little house was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed to hum with comfort rather than emptiness. She let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, a sigh of contentment, of arrival. The living room was softly lit by a lamp shaped like a seashell, its golden glow casting warm circles on the walls. A small clock ticked slowly on a shelf, each sound steady, measured, soothing. The rhythm seemed to blend with the current, turning her home into a cocoon of calm. Mrs. Puff moved toward the kitchen, her fins brushing against the wooden table, polished smooth from years of use. She set a small kettle on the stove. The flame flickered beneath it, a faint light dancing on the metal. As the water began to warm, she busied herself arranging her tea things. A delicate cup rested on a saucer painted with tiny flowers, a teapot patterned with seashell swirls. She had collected these over the years, little treasures she'd chosen carefully. To anyone else, they might have seemed ordinary, but to Mrs. Puff, they were pieces of memory reminders of trips to small markets, of quiet afternoons browsing stalls for just the right design. The kettle began to hum gently, its sound like the first notes of a lullaby. Mrs. Puff stood nearby, watching the thin stream of steam rise, curling and dissolving into the air. She found herself mesmerized by its shape, how it drifted upward as though it carried invisible thoughts away. When the whistle began, soft but insistent, she lifted the kettle with steady fins, pouring the water into her teapot. The sound of liquid filling the pot was music in itself, deep and steady. She placed the lid on top and let the leaves steep, the fragrance of her tea spreading slowly through the room. Carrying the pot and cup to the table, she settled into her favorite chair. It sat by the window, though she left the curtains drawn, preferring the soft intimacy of her lamp's glow. She poured herself a cup, watching as the amber liquid filled the porcelain. Steam rose in delicate swirls, curling toward her face. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the warmth of the scent settle into her chest. The first sip was quiet bliss. The tea was warm, smooth, a touch floral, grounding her in the moment. She cupped the porcelain gently in her fins, savoring not just the taste, but the act of holding something so delicate, so carefully chosen. The warmth spread from her fins to her heart, easing away the last remnants of the day's fatigue. Her gaze drifted around the room. On the shelf across from her, framed photos lined the surface. She leaned back in her chair, smiling softly as her eyes moved over them. One showed her standing proudly beside the boating school building when it first opened, her fins clasped together, her face full of nervous excitement. Another captured a group of students clustered around a boat, their faces lit with laughter. And tucked in the corner, one photo showed a much younger Mrs. Puff at sea, steering a small boat across open water, her eyes wide with adventure. She reached for the photo of her first class. The frame was simple, the picture slightly faded, but the joy on those young faces was unmistakable. She traced the fin along the edge of the glass, remembering their voices, their eagerness, their triumphs. So many years had passed. So many students had come and gone. But each had left something behind in her heart. The photo felt like a promise to herself, a reminder of why she had chosen this path. Mrs. Puff set the picture back carefully and returned to her tea. The clock ticked on, steady like a gentle heartbeat. Each sip matched the rhythm, each breath folded neatly into the calm. The lamp glowed softly beside her, the steam from her cup rising like a fragile thread connecting her to the stillness of the room. There was no need for conversation, no need for company. The night itself was her companion, wrapping her in a silence that was not empty but full of memories, of gratitude, of peace. The tea had cooled slightly now, but the warmth still lingered in Mrs. Puff's fins as she set the cup gently onto its saucer. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes half closed, listening to the quiet ticking of the clock. Each sound seemed to echo like a gentle reminder that time was moving forward slowly, patiently, with no urgency. It made her feel unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world to simply be. The lamp beside her glowed steadily, casting light across the framed photos once more. Her eyes drifted back to them, lingering this time on a picture of a boating competition held years ago. Students had lined up proudly beside their boats, ribbons pinned to their chests, their smiles wide with accomplishment. Mrs. Puff remembered the chaos of that day, the near collisions, the splashes, the moments where her heart nearly stopped from worry. But in the end, she had also remembered the glow of pride when each student, no matter how shaky, had managed to cross the finish line. She let out a soft chuckle, the sound barely louder than the clock's ticking. How strange, she thought, that even the most stressful moment, when remembered through the lens of time, could become tender, softened by distance. They weren't just memories of difficulty. They were threads in the larger fabric of her life, woven in alongside the calmer, gentler ones. Taking another sip of tea, she allowed her gaze to wander toward the window. Though the curtains were drawn, the faint silver of moonlight peeked through the edges, brushing the fabric with a shimmer. She imagined the town outside, still sleeping peacefully, the currents carrying dreams through the streets. The thought soothed her that the same calm she felt now stretched outward into every corner of Bikini Bottom. Her fins moved absently towards the teapot, refilling her cup. She watched the steam rise again, spiraling upward in intricate, fleeting patterns. Each wisp dissolved too quickly to grasp, yet there was beauty in its impermanence. It reminded her of her students always moving, always growing, never staying the same. They came to her full of energy, learned what they could, and then drifted off into their own journeys, leaving behind memories that glowed like faint stars. She looked again at the photo of her first boating class. How young they all seemed, how hopeful. Some of them, she knew, had gone on to master boating. Others had taken entirely different paths. She wondered where they all were now, what seas they traveled, what lives they built. The thought didn't sadden her. Instead, it filled her with a quiet pride. She had been part of their beginnings, part of their stories, even if just for a short time. The clock chimed softly, marking the passing of another hour. Mrs. Puff glanced at it, her smile deepening. Time had moved so gently tonight that she hadn't noticed. She reached for another picture frame, this one of a celebration at the school. Balloons had filled the room, banners stretched across the walls. She remembered baking cupcakes for her students that day, her fins dusted with flour, her heart light with joy. The photo captured laughter frozen in time, her own face in the background beaming proudly. Setting the photo back down, she wrapped both fins around her cup, holding it close to her chest. The tea was nearly finished now, but the warmth was more than physical. It was a warmth that came from gratitude for the years she had lived, the people she had met, the small joys she had been blessed to experience. Her home was not grand, her days not extraordinary, but the gentle thread of her life had been enough. More than enough. She thought of SpongeBob then, her most persistent, chaotic student. The corners of her mouth curled upward as she remembered his endless optimism, his tireless determination. How many times had he tested her patience? How many times had she feared for his safety behind the wheel? Yet despite it all, there was something about him that reminded her of the steam rising from her cup, fleeting, chaotic, yet full of beauty if only one paused long enough to notice. Perhaps one day, even his most disastrous boating lessons would become fond memories softened by time. Mrs. Puff leaned back again, her eyes drifting to the ceiling where shadows swayed gently in the lamplight. She let the silence settle over her, not heavy but light, like a blanket of comfort. The tea, the clock, the lamp, the photos, all of them, formed a tapestry of stillness, of presence. She realized she didn't need anything more. The world outside could wait. Here, within these walls, she had everything she needed to end the day in peace. The tea was nearly gone now, but Mrs. Puff lingered with the cup in her fins, holding it close as though it still carried warmth. She tilted it slightly, watching the last drop shift inside, the faint reflection of the lamp shimmering against the surface. There was something comforting about the smallness of it. Just a little bit of tea, a little bit of light, a little bit of time, enough to make a night feel whole. She set the empty cup back onto its saucer and leaned into her chair, the cushions pressed gently against her back, shaped by years of evenings spent just like this. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the clock fill her ears again. Each tick was steady, unchanging, like a soft heartbeat reminding her of life's consistency. No matter what the day had brought, no matter what tomorrow would hold, there would always be this gentle sound in the background, promising continuity. Her gaze lifted again to the photographs. She found her eyes settling on one tucked in the corner, smaller than the rest. It was of her and another teacher, smiling side by side after a long day of lessons. She remembered that day vividly, the exhaustion, the laughter they shared as they recounted their students' antics. The teacher had since moved on, but the memory remained, captured in that single frame. Mrs. Puff's lips curved into a quiet smile. Life, she thought, was built not only from great milestones, but also from these small, unremarkable moments that lingered quietly in the heart. She rose from her chair, stretching her fins slowly, and carried her cup to the kitchen sink. The soft clink of porcelain against the counter sounded louder in the stillness of the house, but even that sound seemed to settle back into the silence like a note completing its melody. She rinsed the cup gently, watching the last traces of tea swirl away before setting it carefully aside. Her movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial, as if even this simple task deserved its own place in the quietness of the evening. Returning to her chair, Mrs. Puff took a moment to adjust the lamp, lowering its brightness until the room was bathed in a softer, golden glow. The shadows grew deeper, stretching long across the floor and ceiling, making her little home feel even cozier. She wrapped her fins loosely across her lap and leaned back, gazing once more at her surrounding. The air was filled with the faint scent of tea leaves, lingering like a memory. It reminded her of all the nights she had ended this way, in stillness, in reflection, in gratitude. She wondered how many more evenings she would have like this, and the thought didn't bring sadness, but rather a kind of reverence. Each night, each cup of tea, each tick of the clock was precious because it was finite, and yet, because it was finite, it was beautiful. Her thoughts wandered softly to the boating school. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, and perhaps a few more moments of chaos courtesy of SpongeBob. She chuckled under her breath at the thought, shaking her head slightly. But even that, she realized, had become part of the rhythm of her life. The frustrations, the sighs, the laughter, the small triumphs they all wove together to make her days meaningful. She would face tomorrow with patience, because patience was part of her, just as teaching had always been. Mrs. Puff's eyes grew heavy as she sat there, the lamp's glow washing over her, the clocks ticking, filling the silence. She wasn't tired in the restless way she sometimes felt after long days. Tonight it was a gentle tiredness, like a wave guiding her softly toward rest. Her fins loosened against her lap, her breath slowed, and her mind drifted toward dreams. Before allowing herself to drift completely, she glanced once more at the photographs. Her gaze lingered on them, letting their faces, their smiles, their frozen moments of joy sink into her. It was as though they were keeping her company, little reminders that she had lived, that she had taught, that she had been part of something bigger than herself. And as long as she carried those memories, she would never be alone. She whispered a soft good night, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself, to the clock, to the lamp, to the photos that looked back at her. The house seemed to respond in silence, its walls holding her words gently, keeping them safe. Mrs. Puff closed her eyes, the faint hum of the ocean outside blending with the ticking of the clock. The tea may have been finished, but its warmth remained in her chest, in her memories, in the quiet stillness of her home. The glow of the seashell lamp seemed softer now, as though it too was winding down for the night. Mrs. Puff adjusted the cushion behind her back and let her fins fall loosely at her sides. The house was utterly still. No creaks, no currents against the walls, no interruptions. Just the slow rhythm of the clock and the faint echo of the ocean outside. She drew in a deep breath, letting the scent of the tea still lingering in the room settle into her. It was faint now, a trace of warmth and earthiness that mingled with the natural salt of the sea. To her, that fragrance was a reminder that even simple routines, boiling water, pouring tea, holding a cup, could become rituals of peace. She realized that this quiet tea time was more than just an evening habit. It was her way of gently anchoring herself, reminding her heart that there was balance beneath all the storms of life. Her eyes lingered once more on the photographs across the room. She noticed details she had overlooked before. The tilt of a student's grin in one picture, the way her own fin rested proudly on a young fish's shoulder in another, the faint sunlight caught in the corners of a frame. These details, small as they were, seemed alive tonight. They reminded her that her life had not just been filled with days passing, but with moments, little beads of time, strung together into something she could hold on to. She rose slowly from her chair, moving toward the shelf where the photos rested. The floor creaked slightly beneath her fins, though the sound was soft, blending into the silence. She picked up one frame, the image of her first boating school ribbon ceremony. Her students were lined up, their faces glowing with pride. Mrs. Puff studied the picture carefully. Her own younger face in the background, smiling wide with the confidence of fresh beginnings. She could almost hear the cheering, almost smell the salt of the water on that day. A warmth spread through her as she held the frame close for a moment before setting it back down. Each of these memories had shaped her. Each lesson, each laugh, each sigh of frustration and joy had built the foundation of who she was. And while life had not always been easy with its stumbles, worries, and difficult days, the balance always seemed to tilt back toward these moments of calm. Returning to her chair, Mrs. Puff poured the very last of the tea into her cup. It was just a small sip, but she held it as though it were precious. She took it slowly, savoring the taste as if it were the final note in a song that had played perfectly all evening. When the cup was empty, she placed it gently back on the saucer, her movements deliberate, careful, reverent. The clock chimed softly again. Another hour passed, though Mrs. Puff hardly felt the time move. It was as though the evening had stretched itself out, giving her more than she expected, more peace, more reflection, more stillness. She felt grateful for that. Sometimes the sea moved fast, rushing one moment into the next. But tonight, it had chosen to flow slowly, letting her drift gently along its current. Her fins rested in her lap again, her eyes half closed. Thoughts came and went like waves. The lessons of the day, the student she would see tomorrow, the quiet pride she carried, the hopes she held for herself. None of it weighed heavy. Instead, everything seemed lighter now, softened by the night's calm. At last, Mrs. Puff reached over and turned down the lamp. The room dimmed, leaving only the faint silver glow of moonlight seeping through the edges of her curtains. The shadows lengthened, swaying gently with the current. Her home was now almost entirely dark, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like a safe cocoon, a space where rest could unfold naturally. She sat for a little while longer in the dark, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of her day melt away. Then, with a soft breath, she rose from her chair and stretched her fins. The floor beneath her was cool and steady as she walked toward her bedroom, the rhythm of the clock following her like a lullaby. Before entering the room, she paused once more to glance back at the shelf of photographs. Her heart swelled, and she whispered a quiet, "Good night," as though speaking not just to the images, but to the memories themselves. With that, Mrs. Puff slipped into her bedroom. The bed awaited, soft and inviting, the sheets gently swaying in the water. She pulled them over herself, resting her head against the pillow. Her eyes closed, and her body relaxed instantly. The tea, the quiet, the glow of her lamp, the rhythm of the clock, all of it settled inside her like a gentle tide. And as the last traces of thought faded, Mrs. Puff drifted into sleep with a calm heart, her evening tea time having carried her gently into dreams. The bedroom was wrapped in a hushed stillness, as though the very waters outside had decided to pause and let the night fully settle. Mrs. Puff's room glowed with the faint shimmer of a seashell lamp placed on the bedside table. Its light was soft and amber, casting rounded shadows that swayed gently with the current. It was the kind of glow that asked nothing of her. No tasks, no effort, no urgency, only quiet presence. Mrs. Puff sat upright in her bed, the coral-patterned quilt tucked warmly around her. The fabric rose and fell with the slow rhythm of her breathing, a gentle cadence that matched the lull of the ocean itself. In her fins rested an old, well-worn storybook. Its cover was faded with age, edges softened from years of turning, but the book had a comfort to it, as though it carried not just stories, but memories of nights past. She opened it carefully, the spine creaking faintly as the pages shifted. The sound was tender, like the sigh of a seashell when pressed to one's ear. The first page greeted her with an illustration of an undersea village, drawn in pastel strokes that glowed faintly under the lamplight. She traced the lines with her eyes, smiling softly as she remembered the first time she had read it long ago, when she was still a young teacher, bright-eyed and filled with dreams of what life might hold. Turning the page, the story unfolded with gentle words. It spoke of a small fish who traveled far beyond the reef, guided only by the light of the moon. The little fish wandered through seas vast and unknown, but always found peace by remembering the gentle current of home. Mrs. Puff's eyes moved slowly over the lines, savoring each word as though it were a lullaby meant only for her. Outside her window, fish swam lazily past, their movements slow and unhurried. Their silhouettes crossed the glass in peaceful procession, sometimes pausing to gaze curiously inside before drifting on. Tiny bubbles rose with them, shimmering in the faint light of the moon as they floated toward the surface. Each bubble, delicate and fleeting, reminded her of thoughts rising in the quiet light, passing, never too heavy to hold. She turned another page, the paper whispering softly between her fins. The story grew warmer as the little fish found companionship on its journey, a jellyfish who glowed gently in the dark waters, a sea snail who carried its home on its back, a starfish who pointed out the constellations above the reef. Each friend guided the small fish forward, each moment a reminder that even in the vastness of the sea, one was never truly alone. The rhythm of the story seemed to match the rhythm of the night itself. As Mrs. Puff read, she felt her breathing deepen, her shoulders sink further into the softness of her bed. The quilt held her like a tide pool, embracing her with steady warmth. She paused occasionally, looking up from the page to watch the shadows dancing along the wall, or the faint swaying of the curtains in the water's flow. Each pause made the story feel even more alive, as though it were not only written in the book, but carried in the world around her. Her fins brushed gently over the illustration of the jellyfish glowing in the deep. She smiled, thinking of her own students and how often they too brought light into her days, even if they didn't realize it. SpongeBob's endless energy, Patrick's innocent wonder, even Squidward's reluctant patience each of them had in their own way, reminded her of the gentle sparks of life. She sighed softly, a sound not of sadness but of contentment. The book was more than a story. It was a mirror. It reflected her own journey, the trials, the lessons, the companionships, the hopes that carried her forward even when the currents grew rough. And here she was, safe in her room, quilt wrapped around her, the ocean whispering just outside. Another page turned. The story spoke now of the little fish, reaching the edge of the sea where the water met the stars. There the fish rested, gazing up at the constellations, knowing that the journey was not about arriving, but about the calm found along the way. Mrs. Puff lingered on those lines, letting them echo inside her. She closed her eyes briefly, holding the book against her chest. The hum of the ocean outside, and the faint ticking of the small shell-shaped clock on her nightstand, and the warmth of her quilt all merged into one soft embrace. Opening her eyes again, she looked once more at the pages, the words waiting patiently for her to return. And so she did. With a small, steady breath, she turned the page once more, the story continuing as her night unfolded in serenity. Mrs. Puff adjusted the pillow behind her, sinking deeper into the softness of her bed. The storybook felt almost weightless in her fins, though its presence was grounding, as if it connected her to something timeless. She turned another page, and the story widened like a tide spilling gently across the shore. The little fish was now traveling through a kelp forest where the tall, swaying stalks bent and whispered in the current. The illustrations were painted in muted greens and blues, with tiny beams of moonlight filtering between the leaves. Mrs. Puff studied the artwork closely, her eyes following the trails of light, almost imagining herself there, drifting slowly between the kelp, listening to the rustle of the leaves, the hush of the sea. She read aloud softly, her voice no more than a whisper. And though the waters grew darker, the little fish felt no fear, for even in the quiet, the sea carried songs the heart could hear. Her own words seemed to blend with the natural hum of the room, the faint trickle of bubbles outside, the slow thrum of the sea pressing gently against the glass of her window. She paused, listening, as though the ocean itself was answering the words of the story. It felt less like reading and more like conversing, her voice carrying the tale forward, the sea replying with its eternal rhythm. Her gaze drifted for a moment away from the book to the window. A school of tiny fish passed by, moving together in one graceful, shimmering shape. They caught the light of the moon, turning it into a ribbon of silver that trailed across the night. Mrs. Puff smiled softly at the sight. The story in her lap spoke of one small fish, but outside the sea reminded her of the beauty of many, all moving in harmony, all part of something larger. She turned another page. The little fish had stopped to rest in a coral cave, where the walls glowed faintly with bioluminescence. The words described the gentle stillness of that place, where the fish curled up and let the currents rock it like a cradle. Mrs. Puff's fins slowed on the page as she read. The description seemed to echo her very own moment tucked in her bed, the quilt pulled snug, the lamp casting a low, steady glow. Her breathing deepened, her eyelids heavy but not unwilling. She read each sentence with care, not rushing, not hurrying to the end. This was not a story to finish quickly. It was a tide to drift with, each line carrying her just a little further into calm. Her thoughts began to weave themselves into the words she read. As the little fish dreamed of the stars, she thought of her own dreams, the ones she used to have of endless adventures, of students who always passed their exams, of living with nothing but peace. Life had not always given her those exact dreams, but it had given her moments, quiet nights like this, where she could remember how gentle the sea could be. She turned another page, and the illustration now showed the fish gazing upward at constellations reflected on the surface of the water. Mrs. Puff tilted her head, smiling softly. Stars above the reef, she had often gazed at those herself during late evenings outside. She remembered nights when she was younger, lying on the sand, looking up through the rippling surface of the ocean to see the stars twinkling above. It always reminded her that the sea was both endless and kind, vast enough to hold mysteries, yet gentle enough to cradle her in its depths. The book seemed to slow her heartbeat, each word a lull in the rhythm of her night. She reached out absent-mindedly to the cup on her nightstand, though it was empty now, holding only the faint warmth of earlier tea. She placed it back carefully, smiling at the thought that her evening rituals had blended so seamlessly. Tea memories, and now a story leading her toward rest. Her fins brushed across the edges of the page again, feeling the slight texture of the paper. She loved the way books carried a life of their own, not only in the words, but in the wear of their covers, the creases of their spines, the softness of their corners. This book had been with her for years, its stories like old companions that never truly left. As she read the final line of the chapter, and so the little fish, though far from home, carried the sea's gentle song in its heart and slept beneath the stars, Mrs. Puff closed her eyes briefly. She breathed deeply, letting the words rest inside her as if she too had been carried across currents and now rested beneath a safe, endless sky. The lamp's glow flickered faintly as if agreeing with her pause. She smiled, then gently turned the page once more, letting the story continue, unhurried, just as the night unfolded around her. The seashell lamp glowed faintly, its amber light painting soft ripples across the walls. Mrs. Puff leaned deeper into her pillow, her fins resting gently on the open storybook. The words, though simple, carried her like a gentle tide, steady, calm, unbroken. The story now spoke of the little fish swimming into the open sea once again, guided by the quiet glimmer of jellyfish lanterns. The illustration showed them hovering like tiny moons, their tendrils swaying softly in the currents. Mrs. Puff paused over the page, her gaze lingering on the soft brushstrokes. She imagined herself drifting there between glowing jellyfish, letting their quiet light be enough to guide her through the night. Her eyes softened as a thought came to her. SpongeBob, with his bright enthusiasm and endless questions, was much like that glowing jellyfish. A little unpredictable, sometimes overwhelming, but full of light that illuminated even her hardest days. Though his attempts at boating often brought her stress, they also carried a kind of innocence she couldn't help but treasure. She smiled at the thought, closing her eyes briefly as though she could see him there, waving brightly before zooming off in one of his famously disastrous practice drives. When she opened her eyes again, the words on the page seemed to speak directly to her. Even when the current grows restless, remember that every wave is only passing. The sea always finds its calm again. She read those lines twice, then 3 times, each time slower. They sank into her like the warmth of her earlier tea, filling the spaces inside her that sometimes grew restless. How many days had she feared the chaos of the classroom, the panic of an accident, the weight of being responsible? And yet every time the sea of her life had eventually settled, the storms had passed, the calm had returned. Mrs. Puff turned another page. The story had entered a chapter about the fish's dreams. The small character floated in a bed of seagrass, imagining faraway reefs glowing like lanterns in the distance. The art shimmered with watercolor hues, deep purples, soft blues, gentle greens. The dream world stretched wide but never frightening. Instead, it looked like a cradle for the heart, a reminder that even in unknown places there could be comfort. As her eyes lingered on the dreamy illustration, Mrs. Puff felt her own memories blending with the story. She remembered a time when she herself had read stories like this as a young student. Her teachers had always told her to let the words be anchors, steadying her in a world that often moved too quickly. And now here she was, older, wiser, yet still soothed by the same rhythm of turning pages. The sound of the pages themselves was a lullaby. Every flip whispered gently, like seaweed brushing against the sand. She cherished that texture, the thinness of the paper, the way it resisted slightly before yielding to her fin. She paused often, not because she was distracted, but because she wanted to give every page time to breathe. Outside her window, a larger fish swam by slowly, casting its shadow across her room. The shadow rippled against her quilt, making it seem as though her bed floated on waves. Mrs. Puff's breathing matched the rhythm, rising and falling in harmony with the ocean's quiet. She let her eyes drift toward the moving shapes outside, finding peace in their unhurried pace. Returning to the story, she read how the fish found a seashell that carried the sound of the ocean, no matter where it traveled. That seashell became the fish's comfort, reminding it that the sea was always near, even in faraway waters. Mrs. Puff closed her eyes again, imagining holding such a seashell in her own fins. But then she realized she didn't need one. Her whole life was surrounded by the sea, wrapped in its lull, carried by its rhythm. The lamp's glow dimmed slightly, as if reminding her that it was late. Yet she didn't rush. The book wasn't a task to finish. It was a companion. She rested her fin gently on the page, breathing in and out, letting the night lengthen in her favor. Her eyes traced the last line of the chapter. Wherever the sea may carry you, it carries also its song. Listen, and you will always find your way home. She read it slowly, then closed the book for a moment, pressing it lightly against her chest. The words hummed inside her, blending with her heartbeat, with the faint hum of the ocean outside, with the rhythm of the night itself. Mrs. Puff let her eyelids lower again, the weight of sleep brushing gently at the edges. She placed the book beside her for a moment, keeping her fin rested lightly on its cover as though she didn't want to lose its comfort. And for the first time in a long while, she felt not just relaxed, but entirely safe. The seashell lamp hummed faintly, its glow steady but gentle, as though it knew the night was reaching its quietest point. Mrs. Puff lay comfortably beneath her coral-patterned quilt, the storybook still open on her lap. Her fins rested lightly on its pages, her eyes scanning the words with slower, softer focus. She wasn't reading to finish anymore. She was reading simply to drift, letting each word dissolve into the rhythm of her breathing. The story now described the little fish finding a hidden lagoon where the water was so calm the surface looked like glass. The illustration was delicate, a soft moon reflected in still waters, surrounded by swaying seagrass. Mrs. Puff lingered on the picture, feeling its peace soak into her. It reminded her of the times she had taken solitary swims after long teaching days, finding quiet corners of the sea where only the soft hum of the ocean remained. Those swims were rare now, but the memory of them carried the same tranquility the lagoon promised in the book. She traced the line of the lagoon with her eyes before reading on. And in the stillness, the little fish realized it was not the journey's end it sought, but the calm it carried within. Her lips curved into the smallest smile. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering the line to herself as though it were a lullaby. The thought stayed with her. Peace wasn't only in places or people, but also in the heart's ability to hold calm, even when the seas grew rough. That reminder felt like a gift from the story, wrapped gently in the night's silence. Turning the page once more, Mrs. Puff slowed her movements, savoring even the act of lifting the corner, feeling the soft resistance before it yielded. The new chapter began with a description of dawn on the horizon. The little fish, drifting into sleep, dreamed of sunlight breaking through the water, carrying warmth and promise. The colors on the page shifted from deep blues to faint golds and pinks, the kind that hinted at morning but still belonged to night. Mrs. Puff's gaze softened. She imagined her own morning to come, sunlight drifting gently into her classroom, the muffled chatter of students, SpongeBob's bright grin, Patrick's unhurried wave from outside. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, yes, but tonight, all she needed was this book, this bed, this stillness. Her eyes grew heavier as she read on. The words seemed to blur gently at the edges, but not unpleasantly. It was the blur of comfort, the way thoughts and dreams began to intermingle. She blinked slowly, tilting her head against her pillow, the book slipping slightly in her fins. She adjusted it back upright, unwilling to let go just yet. Outside her window, the ocean remained alive in its own hushed way. A pair of jellyfish floated past, glowing faintly like lanterns in the distance. Their slow drift mirrored her own, as if the sea itself was keeping pace with her breathing. Tiny bubbles floated upward, catching fragments of moonlight, flickering like stars. She watched them for a moment, mesmerized by their unhurried rhythm. Returning to the story, she whispered the next lines aloud. And as the little fish closed its eyes, the sea sang softly, not to end the day, but to carry it gently into dreams. Her voice was barely more than a breath. The sound dissolved into the room, joining the quiet hum of the lamp and the pulse of the sea outside. It was as though her room itself leaned closer to listen, to hold the softness of her words. She let the book rest on her chest now, closing her eyes. For a long moment she simply breathed. The words still echoed in her, not sharp, not demanding, but gentle waves receding and returning, comforting in their repetition. When she opened her eyes again, the lamp's glow had dimmed slightly, casting longer shadows across the walls. The clock on her nightstand ticked faintly, its rhythm slow and steady like a heartbeat. She realized she had reached the end of the chapter. With quiet care, she folded the cover of the book closed, the sound soft and final, like the sigh of the sea. She placed the book beside her, keeping it within reach. Her fin lingered on its cover for a moment, a small gesture of gratitude for the comfort it had given her. Then, with a slow breath, she pulled the quilt closer around her shoulders, tucking herself deeper into its embrace. Her eyes drifted once more to the window, where the last jellyfish glow faded into the distance. The ocean outside seemed to bow into silence, as though honoring her rest. She whispered one last good night, not to anyone in particular, but to the sea, the stars, the book, the quiet moments that had carried her here. Her eyelids lowered fully now. The lamp's glow softened into nothing, leaving only the shimmer of moonlight brushing across her room. The sea sang its low lullaby, the clock ticked gently, and Mrs. Puff's breathing grew even and deep. Within moments, her thoughts slipped into dreams, and the night held her completely, leaving only the pale glow of the moon seeping through the edges of the curtains. Mrs. Puff lay nestled beneath her quilt, her breathing deep and steady, the storybook resting gently on her nightstand. The quiet of her home was complete now. No kettle whistles, no turning pages, no shifting furniture. Only the hush of the sea outside remained, its presence a constant lullaby. And in that stillness, dreams began to arrive. It started with a ripple, the kind that comes just before sleep carries one away. Mrs. Puff, though sleeping soundly in her bed, found herself floating gently through open water. The ocean around her was vast but calm, endless yet comforting. She wasn't afraid of its size. The sea didn't press or overwhelm. Instead, it seemed to cradle her as though she were part of its very tide. Above, the moon shone brighter than she had ever seen, its light pouring like silver into the water. The beams spread across the sea floor in rippling patterns, weaving shapes that felt familiar. She drifted along them, recognizing outlines that reminded her of her students, of SpongeBob's wide grin, of Patrick's steady, simple laughter. The patterns glowed faintly before dissolving again, as if the sea was gently replaying her memories. Fish swam past her in slow motion, their fins trailing ribbons of light. Their eyes were kind, their movements unhurried, as though they too were part of the dream. A school of glowing minnows encircled her, spiraling upward in a dance that mirrored the stars she sometimes saw from her window. The bubbles they released floated past her, shimmering like lanterns, carrying her deeper into rest. She heard sounds in the dream, not sharp, not loud, but soft harmonies of the sea. A low hum, like the echo of a distant shell, blended with the rhythm of waves. Somewhere in the current, the faint strum of a ukulele drifted by as though someone far away was playing a lullaby just for her. The music wasn't from anyone she could see, but she knew instinctively it belonged to Bikini Bottom, to the home she loved, the life she had built, the gentle memories she carried. As she floated further, she found herself near a meadow of sea flowers swaying in the current. Their petals glowed faintly, opening and closing like breathing. She reached out in her dream, brushing one lightly with her fin, and it shimmered brighter before sending a ripple outward. The ripple carried across the meadow, each flower responding in turn, until the entire field pulsed with soft light. The glow rose upward like mist, surrounding her in a cloud of warmth. Mrs. Puff smiled in her sleep, her lips curling faintly beneath the quilt. Her body shifted slightly as though her dreams were rocking her, the way a boat rocks gently on calm waters. The field of flowers faded, giving way to another dreamscape, a wide reef painted in twilight hues. Coral towers rose like castles, their surfaces shimmering with faint reflections of the moon. Schools of fish swam through their arches, their tails leaving trails of golden sparks. The dream seemed endless, yet not overwhelming. Each moment flowed into the next as naturally as waves rolling on shore. She didn't need to control it, didn't need to direct it. The sea itself seemed to know what she needed. Not adventure, not tests, not responsibility, only peace. In the distance, she saw a soft light growing, not blinding, not harsh, but warm, like a sunrise rising through the water. It reminded her of mornings at the boating school when the day first began. The light called to her, not with urgency, but with reassurance, like the gentle hand of a friend. She swam toward it without effort, her body carried by the tide. As she neared the glow, she realized it wasn't just light. It was the sea itself breathing, pulsing with life. The glow filled her vision, wrapping her in warmth, dissolving every remaining trace of tension. Her mind grew lighter, her body softer, her spirit untethered. Back in her bed, her breathing deepened further, her face resting in complete calm. The quilt swayed gently with the water's motion, and her home lay utterly still around her. And in her dream, the sea carried her fully into its embrace, promising night of endless rest. The glow of the sea carried Mrs. Puff deeper into its quiet embrace. Though she slept soundly in her bed, her dreams stretched wide like an open horizon. She floated through the water as if weightless, her body and thoughts both light, drifting wherever the current wished to take her. The first shapes she saw were familiar outlines of her boating school, but softened, dreamlike. The building stood in the sand, bathed in moonlight, but there was no noise, no chaos, no students crying out as boats collided. Instead, the doors were open, and the classroom glowed warmly, like a lighthouse. Mrs. Puff drifted closer, her dream body passing through the entrance without effort. Inside, the chairs and tables floated just above the floor, swaying gently as though rocked by invisible currents. On the blackboard, written in elegant chalk lines, were words she didn't remember writing. Patience is the boat that carries us to calm waters. She smiled softly, her heart swelling. How often had she begged for patience, struggled for peace in her classroom? And here, in the dream, patience wasn't hard to hold. It was the very air itself, the current she was already swimming in. As she floated through the classroom, the pictures of her students that hung on the walls came alive. They smiled at her gently, not mischievous, not reckless, just kind. Even SpongeBob's wide grin looked calm, softened into a quiet glow. She reached out a fin, brushing lightly against one frame, and the image shimmered like water before fading back into stillness. The scene dissolved around her, the classroom fading into the open ocean once again. Now she found herself drifting through a field of bubbles, rising endlessly toward the surface. Each bubble reflected a different memory, her younger self learning to teach, moments of laughter with her students, peaceful walks through Bikini Bottom at twilight. She watched them float upward, shimmering and vanishing gently one by one. The sight didn't make her sad. Instead, it filled her with gratitude, as though each bubble was a gift rising to join the larger sea. One bubble drifted close to her, larger than the rest. She gazed into it and saw herself sitting in her home, teacup in hand, the seashell lamp glowing just as it had earlier tonight. She realized the bubble was showing her this very evening her tea, her book, her quilt. The dream was reminding her that she had already lived peace before falling asleep. She smiled as the bubble floated upward, merging with the stars above. She continued drifting until she found herself near a reef bathed in silver light. Jellyfish pulsed slowly overhead, their glow casting long shadows across the coral. The water was so still that she could hear her own heartbeat echoing softly within the dream. She listened carefully. It sounded steady, calm, like the rhythm of a gentle drum guiding her deeper into rest. Then in the dream, she noticed something unusual. A boat. Not a wild, out-of-control boat like in her waking life, but a small wooden rowboat, tethered gently to the coral. It swayed slowly with the current, waiting. She moved toward it, placing a fin on its edge, and climbed in effortlessly. The moment she sat down, the boat began to move, not fast, not frightening, but gently, as though the ocean itself was rowing for her. The oars dipped without her touch, pulling her forward across a sea so smooth it looked like glass. She leaned back, allowing the motion to carry her. Above her, the stars glimmered faintly, mirroring themselves across the water's surface. As the boat carried her forward, she felt something deeper than rest, a sense of belonging. The sea wasn't just around her, it was within her. Every gentle pull of the oar seemed to say, "You are safe. You are carried. You are home." Her dream stretched endlessly, but never felt long. Time had no meaning here, only the steady forward glide of the boat, the hush of the sea, and the soft glow of the stars above. Back in her room, her body shifted slightly beneath the quilt, a smile resting faintly on her face. Her breathing slowed even further, the quiet rise and fall of her chest, matching the rhythm of her dream boat's rocking. And so Mrs. Puff drifted on, deeper into the calm, deeper into the ocean of dreams, the night carrying her exactly where she needed to be. The boat glided further, carrying Mrs. Puff across waters that shimmered with quiet beauty. The stars above twinkled gently, mirrored perfectly in the surface of the sea. It was as though she floated between two skies, one above, one below, both endless, both serene. The quiet sound of the oars dipping into the water created a rhythm, a lullaby written only for her. She leaned against the wooden side of the boat, feeling the dream's calm seep into her very soul. The gentle creak of the vessel, the soft hush of waves, and the glowing path ahead all worked together to remind her that peace could be simple. She didn't need to chase it. She only needed to let the sea carry her. After a while, the glow on the horizon grew brighter. It wasn't harsh or sudden, but a gradual bloom of light spreading through the water. The stars began to fade into its warmth, and Mrs. Puff realized she was heading toward something even more tranquil, the arrival of an underwater dawn. The water around her shifted from deep blue to a soft lavender, then into shades of gold. Coral reefs rose again on either side of her, now shimmering like stained glass touched by sunlight. Every branch and every stone reflected the growing light, as though the sea itself had been waiting for this moment. Tiny fish darted between the reefs, their scales catching glimmers of gold, sparkling like coins falling gently through the current. Mrs. Puff sat up straighter in the boat, her fins resting softly on her lap. The light reached her face, and she closed her eyes against its gentle warmth. She felt no hurry to arrive, no pressure to understand. The dream wasn't about goals or destinations. It was about being carried, about surrendering to the quiet. As the boat drew closer, the light revealed something in the water, shapes moving with deliberate grace. Sea turtles, large and ancient, swam beside her, their shells patterned like maps of time. They glided slowly, unhurried, their movements echoing the patience she so often longed for. Each stroke of their fins sent ripples through the water that calmed everything around them. Mrs. Puff watched them with admiration. Their very presence was soothing, reminding her that life could be slow, steady, and still meaningful. She reached out toward one, and in her dream the turtle turned its great head, meeting her gaze. Its eyes shone with a deep kindness, the kind that needed no words. Mrs. Puff felt as though it was telling her something. Rest. You have done enough. Be carried. The turtle swam alongside her until the light ahead grew brighter still, turning the water into liquid gold. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the turtles drifted away into the vastness, their shells fading into the glow. The boat carried her closer to the source of the light. She realized it was not the sun as she knew it, but a glowing heart of the sea itself. A vast, radiant sphere pulsed gently beneath the surface, glowing with warmth instead of heat, filling the water with shimmering trails that looked like threads of silk. It was not something to fear, it was comfort itself, the dream's final embrace. The light reached out to her, not with hands, but with waves that wrapped around her spirit. She felt every worry dissolve, every lingering thought soften, every restless part of herself sink into calm. She was no longer Mrs. Puff the teacher, or Mrs. Puff the worrier, or Mrs. Puff the one always caught in chaos. She was simply a soul resting in the arms of the sea. Her body and bed reflected this serenity. The gentle rise and fall of her breathing had become perfectly even. Her fins were tucked loosely beneath her quilt, her head resting lightly against her pillow. The room around her was still, the only sound the faint hush of water against the window. In the dream, her boat slowed as it reached the heart of light. The oars lifted from the water, resting quietly inside the boat, as though the sea no longer needed them. She sat there, gazing to the glow, her heart so light it felt as if it were floating free. The light pulsed once, twice, then slowly expanded outward, surrounding the boat entirely. She didn't resist. She didn't fear. She allowed it to carry her whole being, filling her with the kind of peace she had only ever wished for during her waking hours. The boat, the water, the reefs, even the stars above, all faded gently into the glow, and Mrs. Puff drifted deeper into dreams where nothing could disturb her, nothing could shake her, nothing could take away the quiet she had found. The glow of the sea wrapped Mrs. Puff in its embrace, and for a time there was nothing else. No sound, no motion, only the quiet warmth that held her steady like a cradle. Her dream no longer needed shapes or places, no longer needed boats or reefs. It had become something simpler, purer, the feeling of absolute calm. But slowly, as if the dream itself wanted to leave her with a gentle farewell, the glow softened into a new vision. She was lying in a meadow of soft seagrass, each blade swaying with the current. Above her, glowing bubbles rose like lanterns, drifting into the distance. The water shimmered faintly, not dark, not bright, but the color of twilight. She looked around and saw that the meadow stretched endlessly. It was not empty, but it was quiet, the kind of place that existed only to bring rest. Her fins touched the grass, and it bent without breaking, as though welcoming her. She lay back into it, and the ocean carried her deeper into stillness. Her eyelids, already closed in her real bed, grew heavier still in the dream. The meadow dimmed into starlight. The bubbles above flickered like tiny moons, reflecting moments of her life, a smile from SpongeBob, the proud face of a student finally learning to steer straight, the soft hum of her own laughter she had nearly forgotten. These memories were not burdens here. They were gifts. She watched them rise and vanish into the night, each one carrying her spirit further toward peace. Somewhere far away, she thought she heard the call of the sea itself. It wasn't a sound made by waves or creatures, but a deep, soothing hum that filled her chest. It reminded her of the way a seashell echoes when pressed to one's ear. She understood, even without words, the ocean was telling her that she belonged to its rhythm, that she always had, that she always would. Her heart grew lighter, and soon the dream faded into a place beyond pictures or words. A soft glow surrounded her, shifting gently like a tide. She was not traveling anymore. She was not drifting, not floating, not moving. She was resting fully without effort. The sea held her, and she trusted it. In the waking world, her quilt rose and fell with the calm rhythm of her breath. The seashell lamp was dark, her teacup empty on the table, her book resting on the stand. Through the window, the moon began to sink lower, making way for the earliest hints of dawn. The ocean outside whispered faintly, its waves rolling against the sand. Her home was silent, yet alive with comfort. The clock ticked slowly, steady as her heart. The world turned, but here, in this little corner of Bikini Bottom, time seemed to pause for her, allowing her sleep to remain untouched. The dream settled into its final shape. Not a meadow, not a boat, not a reef, just stillness. A place where Mrs. Puff's spirit could drift freely and beyond worry, beyond responsibility, beyond the demands of each day. The sea had given her a gift, a night where her rest was whole. Her face, so often marked by strain or weariness, now looked serene. A faint smile touched her lips, the kind of smile that only comes from being carried, from being safe. And so she lay there beneath her quilt, surrounded by the gentle hush of the ocean. The night gave way to dawn, the stars fading one by one. But Mrs. Puff remained in dreams, her heart resting in waters that would hold her until morning. The camera of this quiet scene would pull back now from her room, to the quiet street outside, to the ocean's horizon where the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the surface. The world awakened slowly, but within her home, peace lingered still. The night had not been lonely. It had been full of lights, of memories, of the ocean's endless calm. And as dawn arrived, Mrs. Puff remained in that place between dream and waking, where everything is safe, where everything is gentle, where everything is enough. She was not just a teacher tonight, not just a worrier or a character in the bustle of Bikini Bottom. She was simply herself resting, floating, embraced by the sea. And so the story closed, not with noise, but with silence, a silence deep and steady like the ocean at dawn. A silence that promised she would wake refreshed. A silence that whispered, "Rest is enough. Good night."